All right. Hope all is well with everybody. Andrea is not here today. My wife's not here today, and kids, they're out at Buffalo. They're probably at a soccer game right now. As a matter of fact, my nephew is playing soccer, and my niece had a play yesterday, so they went out yesterday to watch her play, and then to watch Benjamin, my nephew's soccer game today. So that's where they're at, enjoying a little family time over the summer here. I was just talking with Dennis and Linda how it's summertime, man, the sports and just activities never seem to end. So I enjoy it though. So I'm glad that the summer comes. But I tell you, when fall rolls around, it's nice to get out of that summer season though too. But we enjoy it while it's here. So that's where they're at. I hope all of you had a great week and enjoyed the week, enjoyed the weather. We had some nice weather this week, so that's awesome. Today, as we jump into the message, we're going to continue on with our study of the book of Exodus. Today, we're going to kind of, if you remember, last week we had a little bit of a pause. We took a look at a couple of different things in between the ninth plague. We're in the middle of all the plagues, right? And after going through the book of Revelation, man, I don't know if we needed more plagues, but we got a whole bunch more plagues. And so we were looking at we had just kind of finished off with the first 9 plagues, and then we had a pause last week, and we took a look at a couple of events, a couple of things that were instituted that were allowing the Israelites, and we're going to actually see a little bit more of that described this week. But what we saw last week is we took a look at the Passover dinner, and we took a look at the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And those two things, that dinner and that festival, were kind of designed to allow the Israelites to, in future generations, look back and understand what God did through this Exodus, what God did through this deliverance. So as we're reading this, the Israelites, it's being instituted and they're going through it at the same time. So this Passover dinner is being instituted, but they're going through the very thing that this Passover dinner is going to commemorate to future generations. So they're instituting this Feast of Unleavened Bread, but they're going through it as well. They're going through this time where they have to they're being delivered from Egypt, and they have to leave quickly so the bread can't leaven. The bread can't rise, right? They had to leave so quickly that they had to just grab all their food and take off. And we're going to see that this week. So they're kind of, what we looked at last week, they were kind of going through the thing, and they were instituting something to commemorate that thing almost all at the same time. But it was done for future generations as well, so that when you get to the end of life and when you start to pour into your kids and they ask you why you do these things, it said the Israelites were supposed to tell their sons and daughters that it's because God delivered us. That's what we're remembering here. It's because He saved us from this plague, this 10th plague that we're going to kind of see the culmination of today. So that's kind of what we looked at last week. And this week, we're going to look at that final culmination of the 10th plague, and we're going to look at the deliverance of the Israelites out of the land of Egypt. So we're going to see that kind of it's kind of exciting to see. Sometimes we get in those places in life where we're asking for something, we're praying for something for God, and there is a time, many times, in between those prayers and the fulfillment of those prayers that we wait with patience, and we continue to pray, and we continue to seek God. But there's that time where we need to have that patience, and it generally leads to a time of fulfillment, a fulfillment of the prayer. And that's what we're going to see today. We're going to see a time of fulfillment. So let's take a look at this. We're going to look at, it's going to be kind of the end of chapter 12, and then we're going to look at chapter 13 as well today. So let's start off in chapter 12, verse 29. That's where we left off last week. And we're going to look at the 10th plague. So in verse 29, it says, "At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians. And there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. Then he summoned Moses and Aaron by night and said, "Up, go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds, as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also." So just to pause here real quick. So we see this 10th plague. It's the thing that God had been promising. And we saw last week and a couple weeks ago, how Moses told Pharaoh that this was coming. This is not a surprise to Pharaoh. And if it is, he wasn't listening real well. Because this happened just as God had explained. And in fact, God had explained it to Moses right off at the beginning. He said, we're going to have plagues, and Pharaoh's heart is going to be hardened, and he's not going to respond until the final plague. And here we are at the final plague. And the firstborn of everyone in Egypt was struck down, from Pharaoh right onto the probably the lowest person in the dungeon, and their livestock were all affected by this. Their firstborn was killed. So there was death in the land, and there was a great outcry in Egypt. And such an outcry that Pharaoh didn't wait till morning. Such an outcry that Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night and said, "Get out. Get out of here. We're done with this." It was like it was the culmination of everything. All these plagues built up, and Pharaoh, at the end of each one, he decided to harden his heart and not let the Israelites go. But here was the final straw. Here was the kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. And he calls them in the middle of the night and says, "Out, go." And that's kind of a part of why they remember this Feast of Unleavened Bread. He calls them in the middle of the night and tells them to get out in the middle of the night. They don't have time for the bread to rise. They're not waiting for some big feast that they can recline at the table and enjoy. They're to gather up their things, to gather up their clothing, to gather up their food, and take off. It's time to get out. The deliverance is here. It's here. It's the very thing that they've been praying for. And I love that little thing right at the end too. Pharaoh's like, "Take your flocks and your herds as you've said, and be gone." And he says, "And bless me also." You know what? He knew he knew that there was something there. He knew that whether he could get out of his own way or not, he knew that there was something powerful in God, and there was something powerful in what was happening in Israel. And he knew that he wanted to be blessed also. He knew, and the blessing that he wanted at this time was to just make this stop. Please make this stop. Please make it stop. So let's continue on in verse 33. The Egyptians were urgent with the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, "We shall all be dead." So the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls being bound up in their cloaks on their shoulders. The people of Israel had also done as Moses told them, for they had asked the Egyptians for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have what they asked. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. So this thing happened. The Israelites are leaving. The Egyptians say, "Out," again in haste. In haste, they want them out lest they all be killed. There was this fear in Egypt. Finally, there was fear that struck the hearts of the Egyptians, and they said, "Get out." In haste, and again, kind of all this stuff that they're commemorating, all this stuff we looked at last week that they're kind of commemorating is kind of, we're walking through it now. They're leaving. They don't have time for the dough to rise. They got to gather up their stuff and just go, because it's right in the middle of the night. It said the dough didn't have a time to rise, and the kneading bowls they carried on their shoulders. So they left in haste. It also tells us in fulfillment of what was told to Moses back in Exodus 11. And back in Exodus 11, we saw that Moses told the Israelites, "Go to the Egyptians and ask them for gold and silver gold jewelry and silver jewelry and clothing. Get these things from the Egyptians, because when you leave, we're walking out of here, we're not walking out empty-handed. We're walking out with some of the riches of Egypt. All those things that you've been working for, that you haven't been getting paid for, you're walking out with some of this stuff." And that's what happened. So back in Exodus 11, God told Moses that this was going to happen. And here we see it in Exodus 12, that as they walk out, they're given this gold and silver jewelry and clothing. They're walking out with, and it says they plundered Egypt. So as we look at this first chunk here, I want us to have a takeaway, and that takeaway is this: it's be prepared. The Egyptians wanted them to go quickly. We see that in the middle of the night they're asked to go. Their deliverance came at a time probably that they least expected, at a time that maybe was inconvenient for them, but their deliverance came, and they needed to be prepared, and Moses had been preparing them for this all along. He's been letting them know that this is coming. You know, this whole thing with the Feast of Unleavened Bread was kind of letting them know that when it's time to go, you got to go. You got to be ready. When your deliverance is here, when your prayers are answered, it's time to go. You need to be ready to step into the things of God, the things that God has for you. I'm kind of how many of you have seen things happen in your lives, big things happen in your lives, and you kind of take a step back and you're able to look at the events that led up to that? And so many times when I see that in my own life, I kind of see how God has been preparing me for certain things. And it seems like when I look back on those things, he's prepared me for those things in kind of obscurity. It wasn't like he told me like some big thing and then set me on a stage and said, here's your big thing, go do it. He prepared me in obscurity. He prepared me by, mopping the floors and cleaning the toilets and doing things that seemed to be common, but things that prepared me for the things that he was calling me to do. God often prepares us in obscurity, I think. And I look at David, King David, right, that we read about in the Bible. King David, he was a king, but where was he prepared? He was prepared as a shepherd in the fields. Nobody was watching him. He wasn't in front of a lot of people. He wasn't honored and revered as a shepherd boy. He was just out in the field tending the sheep. He was out in the field just kind of protecting the sheep from the lions, protecting the sheep from anything that was going to come by. And don't miss that. That prepared him for being king. God was working in his life and allowing him to understand the kind of care and nurturing that it took to be a king, the kind of courage and strength that it took to be a king. By doing those things that were common, by doing those things that were done when nobody else was looking, when he was just doing those things and being faithful, just to be faithful, not for anybody to see him, not for anybody to pat him on the back or pat him on the head. Even when Samuel came to anoint him as king, even Samuel overlooked him the first time through, right? Samuel kind of thought that it was going to be one of Jesse's older sons, one of Jesse's sons that was maybe a little bit more prominent, maybe a little bit more prepared, appeared the part a little bit better than David appeared the part. But God said, I look on the inside, not on the outside. David was prepared, and God was preparing David all along. God prepares us in this obscurity sometimes. The Bible talks about this in the parable of the 10 bridesmaids. If you kind of get a chance, read through it in Matthew 25. It talks about how 5 of the bridesmaids were prepared for the wedding feast and 5 were not. The 5 that were prepared for the wedding feast went out and got oil for their lamps, it says. And when the bridegroom came at around midnight. He came in the middle of the night to start the wedding feast. He was late. He was late for when they thought he was going to come, but they were prepared. They were ready, and they were able to walk into the wedding feast because they in the middle of the night, they had their lamps and they could go and find their way to the wedding feast. And when they entered the wedding feast, the door was locked behind them. And the 5 bridesmaids who weren't prepared had to go out in the land and try to find some oil for their lamps. And they couldn't find it, and it took them a while. And by the time they found the oil for their lamps and they went back to the wedding feast, the door was locked. And in fact, the bridegroom even came out of the wedding feast and said, I don't even know you. I don't even know you. You weren't prepared. You weren't prepared. And we know, of course, that parable is kind of telling us and talking about that return of Christ. We're not going to know when that return of Christ is happening, but we need to be prepared. We need to be walking and, being faithful in the things that we have at hand to do right now. I think that's what that means, to be prepared. It's just being faithful with what you have to do right now. It doesn't mean worrying about what you don't have and worrying and stressing about all those things you don't have and all the things that are coming up and all the things that God may call you to do in the future. It means being faithful right now. And in that, we're going to be prepared for the things that we have to be prepared for. There's a story of Billy Graham. Obviously probably the most prominent evangelist we've had in our lifetimes. You would think that Billy Graham was always on stage. Everybody knew him from the beginning, but the stories I've been reading about him are really let us know that he used to do just kind of preach at small churches and college campuses and do youth rallies. But the thing was, there are also in those stories you can see that he was somebody who was faithful to study the Word. He studied the Word of God, and he got the Word of God in his heart. And he was very diligent and faithful in praying every day. And in his prayer life was very fruitful and very deep and very consistent. And he was somebody who learned to clearly preach the gospel. He was in obscurity, though. Nobody knew his name. It wasn't until 1949, apparently, that William Randolph Hearst, of all people. William Randolph Hearst was a newspaper magnate, owned a bunch of newspapers in the United States at that time. And William Randolph Hearst actually said, in the quote that I saw, said that he went to his reporters and said, "Puff Graham." That's what he said. That's all he said to his reporters, "Puff Graham." And what he was saying is, go out and I want you to report on this guy, because this guy's doing something good, and I want people to see what he's doing. He told his reporters to go out in 1949 to a crusade that he was doing in Los Angeles. And at this crusade, these reporters went, and the next day they put headlines in newspapers across the country. And all of a sudden, Billy Graham was a household name. All of a sudden, he was known across the nation. But the deal is that he was prepared for that. Can you imagine that story if Billy Graham hadn't been a man of prayer, if he hadn't been a man who studied the Word and who studied what it meant to communicate clearly, concisely, communicate the gospel message? Can you imagine what that story would have been if those reporters put him in the headlines and he was kind of a fraud? If he didn't know what he was doing or what he was talking about? You see, he was prepared. God prepared him for what he was going to ask him to do. So I want to ask us to do the same thing. I want to ask us to be ready. Your answer to prayer may come quickly. Those things that you've been praying about may come quickly. You need to be ready for those things. Your deliverance may come quickly, just like the Israelites here. Their deliverance came in the middle of the night, and they were asked to leave. They were asked to leave their homes. They were asked to leave their home, the place that they lived for years. And we know that Jesus is promising to return like a thief in the night, it says. That's what the Bible says. He's going to return like a thief in the night. And when he comes back, he's going to come back quickly, and he's not going to wait around. That's what that parable of the bridesmaids is really talking about. It's talking about the fact that we need to be ready. When he returns, we need to be ready for the wedding feast. All right, let's move on here. In verse 37. And it says, "And the people of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth." I don't know how you pronounce that. I guess that's right. About 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. A mixed multitude also went up with them, and very much livestock, both flocks and herds. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough that they had brought out of Egypt. For it was not leavened, because they were thrust out of Egypt and could not wait, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. So a couple of things here. As I mentioned last week, we're going to start to see some numbers here, and we're going to start to see how many people are actually coming out of the land of Egypt. And I think that for any of you who have led anything in life, it's hard enough to lead 2 or 3 people any place. What we're talking about here is a large number of people exiting Egypt, and Moses I would imagine, had a heck of a job. Moses and Aaron and the leaders there had a heck of a job trying to get these people moving in the same direction all at once. But we're talking here about 600. It says 600,000 men left and went from Ramesses to Succoth. And if you kind of pair that in numbers, it talks about 603,000 men, it says, of fighting age. So what I think that they're talking about here is there are a lot of other people besides 600,000. So they're when they took the census about a year later, and it wrote about that. It writes about that in the book of Numbers, and it says about 603,000. It says men of fighting age. So that's not including children. That's not including the women, and it's not including the men who are not of fighting age as well. And also, they also indicate in Numbers that they didn't include the Levites in that census as well. So the estimate here is there's about 2 to 3 million people that are leaving the land of Egypt and going where? Where are they going? I don't know. Nobody knows right now. They're going to, the idea is that they're going to this land filled with milk and honey, right? So they know the promise, but they don't know the exact location yet. You know, God didn't give them an address yet. He didn't give them a place where they're going to kind of set up camp. So they're leaving this place, about 2 to 3 million people, and I can imagine the kind of activity that would create. Just I'm just thinking about it from Moses' point of view and just trying to think, oh my goodness, to try to get all those people moving in the same direction at the same time, and then wait for some of the other stuff that we're going to see here too. Some crazy stuff coming up. So the second takeaway I want us to see here is because I want us to take a step back and look where we're at here. And don't worry, I got a couple of, I'm kind of front-loading this message and a couple of things at the end. We're going to kind of skip through some of the actual reading, and I'll ask you to read on your own, if you will, because it's about the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Passover, and it's kind of a bit of a repeat. There's some new things in it, but we're just going to kind of breeze through that. So don't worry. We're front-loading this a little bit. We're gonna tarry here at the beginning, but we're going to kind of speed through a little bit of the other parts here. So takeaway number 2, the second thing I want us to look at here is that the answer is worth the wait. And what I mean by this is I want us to take a step back and look at what's happening here. I want us to see that this is something that the Israelites have been praying for years. This deliverance, the thing that we're reading about now, is something that they have been praying for years. And they've been living under oppression. They've been living under in slavery in a way that was not it wasn't delightful. There was nothing fun about the things that they were going through under the oppression of the Egyptians. And they've been praying for this for years. And now here we begin to read about the actual deliverance, the actual movement of them from the land of oppression, from this land of darkness, this place of darkness for them, into their deliverance, into their freedom. They're stepping out into freedom that they didn't have. This is the answer to their prayers. This is things beginning to happen in their life. And I want us to see that the answer is worth the wait. And another way of saying that is I want us to see that the beauty that is in patience. And we were praying for that a little bit before because I knew this was coming, and this has been kind of on my heart. The patience, man. I am not a patient person. I don't like waiting. I don't like anything about waiting. I just don't like it. and I'm seeing some head shake. Like there are a lot of people out there, I think, that are kindred spirits with me in that we don't like waiting. But I want us to see the beauty of patience. When patience has its full work in us, there is something beautiful that comes out of that. There is something amazing, and there's something powerful, and there's something necessary that comes out of being patient. Let's just take a quick look in James, and it says, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials." So there's going to be this set of steps here. So they fall into various trials, just like the Israelites were in trials. They were under oppression. That was a trial. They're in this trial, this hard thing, this struggle. And it says in James 1, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience, but let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Think about that for a second. That very thing that we hate to do, the very thing, waiting, the very thing that we hate to do when we're waiting on something from God, that very thing produces something in us that says it makes us, it leads us to a place where we're being perfected, that you may be perfect, it says, and complete, lacking nothing. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine that? All of us want to lack nothing. All of us want to be complete and have there be a fullness in us. But the deal is we need to wait sometimes. The deal is we need to go through those trials and let those trials test our faith and let that testing of our faith produce patience, and then let patience have its full work, making us perfect and complete, lacking nothing. There is something amazing in that work of patience that God does in us, that very thing that we hate doing, that's the very thing that creates us. It's the very thing that makes us who we are. It's the very thing that makes us prepared. Going back to our last takeaway, it makes us prepared for what we're called to do. How many of you know the story of Thomas Edison? Thomas Edison, a great inventor, invented the light bulb. And I was reading something about him that said that as he was going through the process of creating or inventing the incandescent light bulb, he probably tested, it says, thousands of materials before he got to that the final thing that actually made a light bulb that actually didn't blow up in seconds. The thing that actually worked, he tested thousands of times in thousands of different ways. And there's a great quote from him. It says, Thomas Edison said, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." You see, he knew what he was doing. He knew that if he continued on, if he knew that if he did the tasks continually and patiently and consistently, that would lead him to his target. He knew that he was going to have to go through a lot of points of failure. He knew that he was going to have to go through a lot of setbacks. But he knew also that if he continued on, that he was going to find the very thing that was going to work. There's a quote by Matt Chandler that I read this past week as well. He's a pastor down in Texas, and he said, just very simply, he said, "If we don't quit, we will win." And I was thinking about that, man, and I was just thinking how, man, anytime I've gone through something that when I've looked back that has been worth it, man, to my to my detriment, I guess, I've looked back at those things, and I almost to the very time, I've wanted to quit at some point. Yeah, has anybody ever been through that time in their life when they're just being pressured and they believe that there's something fruitful in this, they believe that there's something at the end of this struggle, but man, don't you want to quit? Don't you want to quit sometimes? And that's I think what Matt Chandler was kind of talking about here is, listen, if we're going through this and we're doing this, that's really the very thing that James was talking about. Back in James 1, it was saying that we need to go through these trials. We need to allow these things to have their place in our lives, to work in us a patience and work in us a completeness and a fullness where we lack nothing. If we don't quit, we're going to win. So let's remember that. Let's continue on in verse 40. It said the time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. And it was a night of watching by the Lord to bring them out of the land of Egypt. So this same night is a night of watching kept by the Lord by all the people of Israel throughout their generations, so 430 years. Now remember, again, they went in and they didn't kind of step into a land of oppression. They went down as a family. Remember, they went down, Jacob and his sons and their families, about 70 went down there. They didn't step into a place where they were being oppressed. They went down, and Pharaoh at that time gave them the best of the land. Didn't if you remember, that's what it said. He gave them the best of the land. But now we're 430 years later, so at some point in that 430 years, a new Pharaoh comes in and begins to oppress them, and there is a struggle that is happening for years and decades for the Israelites, and they're finally at that point where they're about ready to be delivered. They're at the point of deliverance here. I just want to point out one other thing. It talks about this night as a night of watching, where God was watching over. And I just wanted to point back to the Last Supper and that night when Jesus was talking with his disciples, and he was kind of instituting the communion. And it was the Passover night. And then they went to the Garden of Gethsemane. And what did he tell his disciples? He told them to keep watching and praying. That was a night of watching as well. And this Passover, this thing that's happening, was kind of pointing to Jesus, and we can see that beginning to work out in that Passover night where Jesus was talking with his disciples and said, keep watching and keep praying. There's kind of this amazing thing happening here. Verse 43, let's continue on. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, this is the statute of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat of it. And let me just kind of skip through a little bit of this, only because we kind of looked at the Passover last week, and this is just kind of adding a few things, just maybe kind of describing it a little bit differently, just basically telling who can partake of the Passover. It says, no foreigner shall partake. It shall be eaten in the house. No bones shall be broken of the lamb. And that kind of, again, foreshadows what happened with Jesus on the cross, how they went to break his bones. That was customary to do for the Romans when they were crucifying. They were supposed to break the bone of the one who would be crucified so that they would die faster. But by the time they went to do that, Jesus was already dead. They didn't break a bone. And so here it's saying the same thing. Remember that. Remember that no bones will be broken of this Passover lamb. And then it says that foreigners can partake if they are circumcised, though. So let's just continue on here in verse 50. And it says, all the people of Israel did just as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. And on that very day, the Lord brought the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their hosts. So really quick, it happened. They were delivered, the thing that they'd been praying for. And it says the people obeyed what was commanded of Moses and Aaron. And they were able to walk out of the land of Egypt, not empty-handed, with plunder, and they stepped into a place of freedom. So chapter 13, let's continue on. In verse 1, it says, the Lord said to Moses, consecrate to me all the firstborn, whatever is the first to open the womb among the people of Israel, both of man and of beast, is mine. So this is going to be explained a little more below, so we'll look at that in a second here. But they're consecrating, they're setting apart the firstborn of everybody in Israel, just to commemorate what happened. That there was a Passover. They saved, they kept out of harm's way all of the firstborn of Israel during this Passover, during this time when the Israelites were coming out of Egypt, during the 10th plague. So God is telling them to commemorate the firstborn. And then there's a chunk here that's going to get into the feast of unleavened bread again, and kind of describe that in some more detail. And we're going to kind of, I'm just going to kind of breeze through that just for the sake of time here. And real quick, they basically kind of further explain this feast. It's done basically saying the same thing that we've kind of read before, how it's done as a remembrance of God's act of delivering Israel out of Egypt. So there's a remembrance that is happening here, and it's set to be a yearly event so that people in generations to come will be able to point back to this, will be able to remember what happened, how God delivered the people of Israel. So let's take a quick look now down at verse 11. When the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, as he swore to you and your fathers, and shall give it to you, you shall set apart to the Lord all that first opens the womb, all the firstborn of your animals that are males that are to be the Lord's, every firstborn of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb, or if you will not redeem it, you shall break its neck. Every firstborn of a man among your sons you shall redeem, And when in time to come your sons ask you, what does this mean? You shall say to him, by a strong hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt from the house of slavery. For when Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of animals. Therefore I sacrificed to the Lord all the males that first opened the womb, but all the firstborn of my sons I redeem. It shall be as a mark on your hand or frontlets between your eyes, for by a strong hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt. So real quick here. So basically, this is kind of, so we see the Passover, we see the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This is another thing that they're kind of instituting to be able to remember the things that are happening here. So again, they're instituting these things and going through them all at the same time. So they're dedicating their firstborn. They dedicate their firstborn animals, all the clean animals, all the animals that are considered ceremonially clean. They sacrifice the firstborn. Animals that are unclean ceremonially, they redeem them with a clean animal, and that's sacrificed. People are not sacrificed. The firstborn sons are not sacrificed. They are redeemed, but they are set apart for the work of God, for the work that God's doing, and just in remembrance of the fact that the firstborn have been saved from this 10th plague. All right, let's finish up here, because I want us to see something here in this next chunk, and I want us to see how they're going to continue to follow God and what they're doing to follow God through this. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. So it would have been easier to head out towards the Philistines, probably physically easier, logistically easier. It's probably a clearer path, and it wasn't a wilderness. It would have been easier to head out in that direction. But what God's saying here, what this is saying here, is that He didn't send them that way, because had He sent him that way, they would have run into the Philistines, and war would have ensued, and they would have been fearful, and they would have gone back to Egypt, is what He's saying here. Then it said, but God led the people around by way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea. So He sends them instead by way of the wilderness. Seemingly a harder way to go, but God knows the beginning from the end, and He knows what would have happened each direction. So in verse 19, Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones with you from here. So just real quick here, Joseph, back when he was alive, he made them swear. Joseph understood what was happening here. He understood the promise that his grandfather Abraham had received. The promise was that God was going to give his descendants a land flowing with milk and honey. And Joseph knew that Egypt wasn't this land that they were going to get. He said, when you go out to the land of the Canaanites, when you go out towards the place that God is going to give us, I want you to bring me with you. I don't care if I'm dead. You're going to bring my bones with you. And here we kind of see the fulfillment of that. They took the bones of Joseph. They took him with them, knowing that this was a fulfillment of the promise that God had spoken decades and centuries before to Abraham. This is a fulfillment of that promise. In verse 20, and they moved on from Succoth and encamped at Etham on the edge of the wilderness, and the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart from before the people. So God led them out of Egypt. Doesn't lead them. He leads them towards the wilderness. Seemingly not the easier way to go, but in the long term, it is the easiest way to go, and it's a way that's going to prepare them. I want us to see something here. How He leads them. With a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. God leads them, and the Israelites need to train themselves to keep their eyes on this pillar, on this cloud, for their direction, to know where they need to go, to know which way they're going forward, to move this 2 million people in the same direction at the same time. They needed to keep their eyes on God. And I want us to see something else here, that wasn't just it wasn't just a pillar of cloud and it was fire. In verse 21 it says, and the Lord went before them by day and in a pillar of cloud and in the pillar of fire. The Lord was in it. It was the presence of God they were following. They needed to train themselves to follow those things, to follow the presence of God, to continually keep their eyes on the presence of God. In Hebrews 12:2. So that's our third takeaway here. Keep your eyes on God. I want us to have that, and I want us to remember that. Keep our eyes on God. That's our third takeaway. In Hebrews 12:2, it says, and it's talking about, they're talking about running with endurance here. And it says, we do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus. They were keeping their eyes on the presence of God. We need to do no less today. We need to keep our eyes on the presence of God. I think I've used this, and we're going to kind of end here. But I think I've used this before, that the kind of the analogy of a laser-guided missile. If any of you know anything about it, and I know very little about laser-guided missiles, but I have read this, that a laser-guided missile, when it is launched and it acquires the target, that's not the first calculation it makes. The first calculation, it gets the target, and then it makes dozens and hundreds and thousands of further calculations, and every second, every millisecond is readjusting itself to hit the target. It's in essence keeping its eye on the target. It's keeping its eye on the target and adjusting itself to where the target is. And when we keep our eyes on God, we need to understand that we need to continually keep our eyes on God. We don't pray one day and then pray a year later and wonder why we didn't hit that target. Because we need to continually adjust. We need to continually make sure that we are on the path to hit the target. And that laser-guided missile doesn't stop calculating until it hits the target. We need to keep praying until we hit our target, until we hit the target. When we lose our way, we will lose our way if we stop keeping our eyes on God. So I want us to remember that. So as we, I'll just have Fred come up, and if we can just to recap the last few things here. First off, we need to be prepared. We need to remember that God is with us, but we need to be at the business of even in obscurity, of doing the things that He's calling us to do to prepare us for the things in the future. Secondly, the answer is worth the wait. Those things that you've been praying for, don't grow weary in praying for those things. Don't grow weary and lose heart. Don't lose heart. The answer is worth the wait. When God answers your prayer, when God does the thing that He says He's going to do, it's worth the wait. And it's a beautiful thing, and it's a powerful thing. And lastly, keep your eyes on God. Keep your eyes on God and keep refocusing, just like that laser-guided missile. Don't stop praying. Don't stop seeking His face. Don't stop moving towards Him until you hit that target. Amen.